Welcome to the next in our series of energy storage webinars affiliated with the upcoming Grid Storage Launchpad at Pacific Northwest National Labs. This will be the first DOE-funded grid energy storage R&D facility that will focus on validating performance of grid energy storage technologies and then collaborating with industry to accelerate the adoption and the effective and economic utilization of energy storage on power systems across the spectrum, resource, T&D delivery through end use. And along those lines, today's webinar will feature a PNNL staff leader and manager who oversees our regulatory policy practice area, Jeremy. But before we get to Jeremy, I do want to highlight that PNNL's energy storage R&D does orient ourselves in four thrust areas. The first is cost competitive technologies. That's finding pathways to the next generation energy storage, essentially the batteries that get us to the levelized cost of storage of 5 cents per kilowatt hour and the practical implementation of long duration storage, 10 hours plus. Another practice area is validated safety and reliability, where I work, where it's primarily filling gaps in energy storage standards and codes. A third is industrial acceptance, where we have a team that have developed very robust and rigorous methods to run load flow to assure deliverability of energy storage services and capabilities, as well as production simulation to test the economics, the viability from an economic standpoint. But our fourth, and in some ways most important for today's thrust area, is policy. If there isn't a mechanism to very clearly identify who's investing for what reason and what mechanisms are in place to recover that investment, energy storage for that application will not go forward. Jeremy Twitchell, who does manage our policy area, comes to us from the regulatory community. But from working with Jeremy, I do really admire his ability to be very broad-minded. So among my colleagues, he is probably the most aggressive in attacking these questions from all sides, not just the regulatory ratepayer side, but as well as the investor side. And you'll see that, I'll say, width of perspective presented today in his presentation. I won't give an introduction to the presentation. You all know the topic. Being here, again, thank you for attending today. And I do want to hand over the mic to Jeremy as quick as possible so he can jump right into his material. Thank you. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie, for those kind words. I'm blushing over here. I do appreciate that. So let me share my screen here. Okay. All right. Does that look all right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you everyone for coming today. Today I'll be talking about some recent work that we've done on our team to look at this idea of using energy storage, not just as a transmission asset, but also as a dual use asset, where it's providing a regulated transmission function as well as a competitive market function and earning revenue from both sides of that equation. I want to begin by acknowledging my co-authors on this work, Drew Butnagar, Sarah Barrows, and Kendall Mongard. Also want to acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting today was funded by the Water Power Technologies Office through their HydroWires program under the direction of Samuel Bachenauer. I also want to acknowledge our project partners at our National Laboratory led by Zhu, who have taken this participation framework that I'll be talking about today and developed an economic model to look at what are the values associated with dual use energy storage. And their report on that topic was recently published. So just a quick overview of what we're talking about today. So back in 2017, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, they put out a policy statement expressing support for this idea, for the idea of using storage as both a regulated transmission asset and a competitive market asset. The challenge, though, is that to date, no wholesale market operator has put in policies to that effect that have enabled this kind of use. So the objectives of our project were to first develop a participation framework for dual use energy storage assets. What would it actually take to enable their participation on the grid? How do we get them in as transmission assets and then allow them to also participate in the market? And then, as I said, Argonne took that work that we did and then built an economic model around it to figure out what would be the value of that approach. So a little more detailed view of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll talk about this idea of storage as transmission. What do we mean when we say that? Some foundational principles. We'll get into the difference between storage as transmission and storage in place of transmission. It sounds like a nuance, but it's a very important distinction from a regulatory standpoint, and we'll go through that a little bit. Then we'll move into the idea of storage as a dual use asset. And, what are the principles that underlie that idea? We'll talk a little bit more about FERC's policy statement and what their objectives were. The regional proceedings that tried to implement this policy statement but were suspended. And then I'll get into the work that we did to identify what are the principles that need to be put in place to allow this type of usage for energy storage. All right, so storage as transmissions. This idea actually goes back a while. So back in 2005, Congress put out the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And one of the things they said in there is that energy storage could be what they called an advanced transmission technology, which really means any technology that increases the capacity, efficiency, or reliability of the transmission system. FERC built on that a little bit in Order 890 in 2007, where they required transmission owners to have transparent public planning processes for how they were building out their system. Then in 2011, FERC came back with Order 1000 and said, all right, now we want to do this on a regional basis. We want regional coordination among transmission owners to collaboratively plan the system. In that order, they also required the consideration of non-transmission alternatives in the planning process. And then really, arguably the most important step that Charlie pointed out to me a few days ago was Order 784 in 2013, where FERC actually created a regulatory account for energy storage assets put in as transmission. And from a regulatory standpoint, that's important because that sends the signal to utilities and developers that FERC will actually support this type of use and actually allow them to recover their costs of those investments. Oh, and you can see the image there. Those are just the Order 1000 regions. That's how everyone kind of coalesced to implement Order 1000. The one in the Northwest, the purple and the yellow groups, they actually merged last year into a single entity. But those are the Order 1000 planning groups. So when we talk about storage as transmission, the key thing to keep in mind are thermal limits. So the metals that we use in transmission lines, they're not perfect conductors. So as electricity moves through them, they heat up, they expand. So that's what causes line losses. We lose some of that electrical energy as heat. As they expand, they also begin to sag. And so because of this phenomenon, when we're talking about the rating of a transmission line, we're not necessarily talking just about how much power can move through it. We're talking about how much heat it can withstand. So that rating is going to be dependent not just on the amount of electricity moving through it, it's going to be dependent on the ambient temperature, wind, many other factors. And so energy storage can be a valuable tool for alleviating this idea of thermal overloading, of keeping lines within their limits. So a few examples of this. So if we've got a line that's serving, running into an urban area and there's high demand in the afternoon, we can put energy storage in that load pocket. We can fill it up ahead of time so that when we come to the peak period, we're not trying to push as much electricity through that transmission line. We're facilitating a more steady use of the line. We're not just pushing it to its limits during peak periods. We can also put storage in the system in ways that it's maintaining voltage, it's managing power flows, it's absorbing excess power flows, it's doing things like that. The idea here is that when strategically placed in the transmission system, we can use energy storage to defer the need for additional investments. We can maybe displace those needs, and we can protect and extend the life of existing transmission infrastructure. And then we can do this by deploying storage as a transmission asset or instead of transmission. And I'll get into a couple specific examples of what that means. So looking at storage as transmission, so back in 2019, the MISO transmission expansion plan identified a need for storage in the Waupaca, Wisconsin area. And you can see Waupaca there, the red line that kind of moves up the side and then cuts across and keeps going. That's a 345 kilovolt line. And in their plan, they found that if there was an outage somewhere along that 345 kV line, the entire Waupaca area could be cut off. And so they looked at a couple options. They looked at adding additional lines in the system, but they found that the most cost-effective option would be to put a storage system in the middle of Waupaca, that purple dot you see, and then sectionalize the line. So effectively add some capacitors so that if there is an outage, instead of Waupaca being dropped, the lines can switch. One line can switch to be fed by the line that's still active on the other side, and the other side of town can be supported by the energy storage asset. And this project cost an estimated $12.2 million compared to $13.1 million for building additional lines. So it's important to know that as a transmission asset, the storage system costs were recovered through MISO's transmission system rates. It does not participate in MISO's markets. It does not receive market compensation. It is only a transmission asset. The other side of that, we can look at the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative in California. So downtown Oakland has a 165 megawatt jet fueled combustion turbine. I did not know that was a thing before this project. I didn't know we had jet fueled power plants. Obviously, a lot of local emissions for the community there, a lot of noise, a lot of impacts. And so as this facility aged, it was targeted for retirement. The challenge, though, is that without that generation within the load pocket, there were a number of contingency scenarios where Oakland would not be able to be served, where there would be insufficient ability to move power into the load pocket. So they looked at a few options. They looked at rebuilding lines, reconducting lines, putting a new natural gas turbine in there. And what they found to be the cheapest and most effective option was actually a mix of distributed generation and storage in the Oakland area. So the utility there committed to install about 43 megawatts of energy storage. And then the community choice aggregator that provides generation for Oakland residents created some programs to help local customers install distributed solar as well as distributed storage. And that collective action created enough generation and backup power within that load pocket to address all the contingencies that have been identified. Now, opposite of what we talked about in Wisconsin, these are generation assets only. They do not receive transmission compensation. They are compensated through energy markets. They receive capacity payments. They receive energy payments. They can participate in ancillary service markets. But so that they're generation assets only, but because they are on the grid, there was a reduced need for transmission system investment. So we've talked about this idea of using storage, as or in place of transmission. We've talked about it participating in markets or being a transmission asset. But right now in the regulatory structure we have, it's got to be one or the other. How do we enable it to be both? So the key principle to keep in mind here is that, even on a fully contracted, heavily utilized transmission line, there's going to be unused capacity most of the time. So WEC does this great study every few years called the State of the Interconnection. And what they do is they look at how is this system actually being used, not necessarily how it's contracted, how it's committed, but how is it being used? And what they found is that for about 94% of the time, so most of the time, the average line in WEC is being used at 75% or less of its rated firm capacity. Conversely, it's exceeding 90%. The average line is exceeding 90% of its rated firm capacity, only about 1% of the time. So the implication here is that if we deploy energy storage as a transmission asset, there's going to be a lot of time where it's not needed to provide that transmission service, and it could be doing other things. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? We build the grid based on peak needs plus reserve margins, but we're only at that peak a few hours a year. So the rest of the time, we have excess capacity, we have excess transmission, and if it's just a transmission line, it's being used or it's not. But if it's storage, if it's not being used as transmission, it can go do other things. And so FERC recognized this in 2017, and they put out this policy statement where they said, if we've deployed storage as a transmission asset, it can also provide market services. And the key objective here to keep in mind is that FERC was doing this to reduce system costs. So they said, if this asset is participating in the market, that market revenue has to be shared back with customers so that we're achieving a reduction in system costs. And so FERC provided 3 guiding principles for this. They said no double recovery of costs. So if you're a dual use asset, you can't make all your money as a transmission asset and then make all your money as a generation asset and then keep it all because there's no cost reduction if that's the approach. Minimize adverse impacts on markets. So this dual use asset, because it's a transmission asset, it can't create market power. It can't have unfair access to the market that other competing market assets don't have. And then finally, the ISO or the RTO's independence must not be compromised. And so what that means in practical terms is when the asset's being used for transmission, it's under control of the ISO. When it's being used for generation and when it's participating in markets, it's under control of the asset owner or the owner's agent to formulate those market bids and actually participate in the market. What you see there on the right is just kind of a generic example we put together of what this revenue sharing looks like. So we just took a generic $10 million transmission system investment, and we assumed that it could generate $50,000 a year in offsetting market revenue. And so you can see there that what ratepayers would pay over time netted against what they would earn. Ratepayers would receive about $2 million back over the 40-year life of the asset. And that net transmission revenue requirements would actually be about $9.5 million instead of the $10 million. So what, on a net present value basis, what ratepayers are paying for that asset is decreased. And I'll just say that the economic analysis that our partners at Argonne did showed that these market revenue credits that we assumed here were very conservative, that an asset is going to be able to generate significantly more market revenue than that. The key note to keep in mind about a policy statement is it's non-binding. It does not require anybody to do anything. It's just guidance. CAISO, the California Independent System Operator, and MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator, or Mid-Continent, excuse me. They're the only regions that have taken this idea on, this dual use energy storage idea on. We'll talk about that a little more in depth. So CAISO's proceeding, a few key things that came out of it. They said, for a storage asset to be dual use, it has to be a transmission asset first. And if you think about it, this makes sense. We have low barriers to entry to participate in the market, but very high barriers to entry to be a transmission asset. So if you're a market asset, there's not really a pathway for you to come back and say, oh, but yeah, I also want to be a transmission asset. But if you come in as a transmission asset and you're identified as a transmission asset, then it's much easier to go and participate in the market. So transmission first. CAISO said that an asset's ability to participate in the market would depend on the need. If that contingency need that the storage asset is meeting is predictable, then it can participate in the market during the down periods. CAISO determined that if that contingency need was not predictable, if the grid operator doesn't really know when that contingency could happen, then it would not ever be allowed to participate in the market. One of the big things that came out of the CAISO proceedings, they also spent a lot of time thinking about cost recovery, and you can see 3 options there that were discussed. I know it's kind of small. The important thing to notice is the blue line refers to the regulatory recovery. So this is its transmission revenue, what it receives as a regulated asset. The red line is its market recovery, what it receives by participating as a generation asset in the market. The first option they looked at was they said, okay, we'll give you your full recovery as a transmission asset, but then anything you earn in the market gets returned to customers. Well, it didn't take long to realize, well, the challenge there is there's no incentive for the asset owner to actually participate in the market. If I have to give everything back to customers, I'm incurring additional wear and tear on my asset and not receiving anything. So I have no incentive to go and participate in the market. So they looked at this second option and we said, okay, we'll do a reasonable forecast of what we think you can earn in the market, and we'll reduce your regulated recovery by that amount. So you'll get some guaranteed recovery, and then you just keep whatever you earn in the market. Couple challenges there. Developers didn't like this idea of having less certainty in their recovery. Transmission assets are viewed as safe investments, and they didn't like this idea of taking on more risk. The other challenge is if we're really pushing developers or asset owners to participate in the market, they may over participate. They may wear out the device and, ahead of schedule, so that we're not really achieving those long-term savings. They burn it up and we don't receive that long-term reliability benefit as a transmission asset. So then they looked at this third option and they said, okay, we'll give you your full regulated recovery as a transmission asset, and then anything you earn in the market gets split. The developer keeps some, the asset owner keeps some, then the rest gets returned to customers. So really, the challenge here is, we need to create recovery mechanisms that create an incentive for asset owners to participate in the market, but still balance economic and reliability objectives. We don't want them to participate too much. We don't want them to burn the asset out, but we do want to generate some revenue to offset the cost and return those savings to customers. So that's the challenge here. How do we balance these competing objectives? CAISO's proceeding was suspended back in January 2019. They have not set a time to resume that. Really what it came down to is this is really an onion issue. You peel back one layer and then there's something else, and you peel back that layer and there's something else. And you just got to the point where they're like, order 2222 is coming out, and they said, we don't have the bandwidth for this anymore. We need to move on to other things. The MISO proceeding, so CAISO, they said, we're only going to talk about dual use storage. We're not going to talk about transmission planning in our proceeding. MISO did the reverse of that. They said, we're going to talk about transmission planning and we're not going to do dual use storage right now. So MISO landed on this idea of storage as a transmission only asset, or SATOA, one of the more fun acronyms in our industry. So they actually have a tariff, a FERC approved tariff that says storage can be used as a transmission asset, but it cannot participate in the market. It is specifically excluded from participating in the market. It cannot earn that revenue. MISO actually indicated at the time that they intended to come back and consider the idea of dual use storage, and they actually opened that proceeding up in March of this year. So in our project, obviously CAISO and MISO and FERC had done a lot of work on this idea, a lot of great thought leadership. What we wanted to do was just kind of stand on their shoulders and say, okay, what would this actually look like? What would a participation framework look like? How do we fix our transmission planning processes to give storage a chance to actually get on the grid as a transmission asset? Then once it's there, how do we create the market mechanisms that will allow it to participate? So that framework is where we were really trying to contribute in this space. So the first thing we looked at are barriers to storage in the transmission planning process. And what we did is we pulled all of the recent regional transmission plans for all those regions that we saw a few slides ago and looked at them to understand, okay, to what degree are they considering energy storage? How are they considering it? And so we identified 5 challenges from that review. First is there isn't really any clarity for stakeholders about how and when storage alternatives will be considered. So if I'm a developer with a storage alternative, in most market regions, there's not really a clear process for how I submit that proposal, what information will be required, how it will be used, how it will be studied. Just a lot of uncertainty about that. Second is the difficulty of representing storage and power flows. These power flow models that are used for transmission planning, they're all about real time, matching up generation and demand in real time. When you add storage in there, you're adding an additional time component. You're adding something that can take energy in this moment and move it to another moment. And that's a challenge for power flow models. They weren't designed to look at an asset like that. There are weak links between transmission and generating processes in a lot of places. So we talked about that CAISO example a few slides ago. So the CAISO transmission planning process said, hey, it would be great if we could have market storage right here. Now, because the way California is set up, then the California Public Utilities Commission could take that and say, okay, utilities put storage there. Most ISOs are working on much larger footprints with a lot of different state authorities, a lot of different state planning processes. So they don't have that same clear link where the grid operator can say, oh, it'd be great if storage is here. And then someone can say, all right, we're going to put market storage there. So that was another challenge we identified. We looked at financial disincentives for utilities to consider storage incentives. Every ISO is different in terms of how it look when it competitively bids transmission system investments. And some of the ISOs are set up in a way that if a storage alternative were selected, the utility would not be allowed to own that asset, or maybe would have to compete with other developers for the right to build that asset. So if I'm a utility and I'm looking at this transmission line that I can build and own and earn a return on, and the storage project that I might not be able to earn a return on, or maybe absolutely will not be able to earn a return on, there's a really big financial disincentive for me to look at that storage. And again, that's not every ISO, but that disincentive is in place in some. And then finally, the lack of regulatory review. FERC has said we want these regional transmission plans to look at storage alternatives, but there isn't really a review process after the fact to make sure that they're doing that, to see that guidance has been put in place. So that's the first thing we looked at. How do we facilitate storage's inclusion in the transmission planning process? And we really identified two key principles. The first is there needs to be a clear and transparent process for when storage can be proposed and how it's going to be studied. And CAISO and MISO provide examples of this. They've done it in totally different ways. In CAISO, they said, look, we know the state wants storage. We know people want storage. So we're going to tell our system planners to proactively look for those opportunities. In MISO, that SATOA tariff we talked about creates a very specific set of guidelines for how and when to make that proposal and what is required and what MISO is going to do with it. So, and again, that makes sense. CAISO, one state, one policy regime, everyone's roughly on the same page. They can be a little more flexible with it. MISO, trying to meet a lot of different state policies, a lot of competing objectives, has to be very specific about how that is done. So those are a couple guideposts for other ISOs and stakeholders as they consider this. And the second thing is to prepare a reasonable forecast of market revenues to quantify that net present value of the asset. So we saw a couple slides ago that if we look at the value of that returned revenue over time on a net present basis, on an upfront basis, that storage asset is actually less, the cost of it is actually less. So if we're accounting for what those future revenues are and getting that correct net present cost, or a reasonable estimate of that net present value, that net present cost, then we're reflecting the true value, the true cost of that storage asset, and it's going to be lower than just the assumed technology cost. So then we started to look at market barriers to dual use storage. So if an asset is on the grid as a transmission asset, what do we need for it to participate in the market? And so we identified, three basic questions that need to be addressed here. First is, when will the asset participate in the markets? Can those participation windows be identified in advance? What happens if needs change? Second question is, how will the asset participate in the market? What are the mechanisms that will allow it to do so? What are those market designs? What are those bidding rules? And finally, where will the asset recover its costs? Again, we talked about the competing objectives. Some of it comes from transmission, some of it comes from market. What is that balance? How do we determine the amount that gets returned to customers? How do we preserve that incentive for the asset owner to participate in the market? We also identified three key principles here as we were putting together this framework. First is reliability. The transmission use comes first. Market participation is just an added bonus, but it cannot be done in a way that jeopardizes the asset's ability to meet its reliability obligations. That much was very clear to us. Incrementalism. What we found is we looked at the way that markets are currently structured around the various ISOs. There are already a lot of market products in place for various assets that look similar to what a dual use asset would look like. Things like reliability must run contracts, limited use resources, energy limited resources. ISOs have different ways of defining these things, but there are a lot of market products for resources that look very much like what a dual use asset would look like. So what we found is that we don't really need to reinvent any wheels. We don't need to make significant changes to market structures. We can leverage existing market products, combine them, adjust them slightly, and come up with a dual use market participation product. And then finally, balance. Again, there's a lot of competing priorities here. We want the asset to participate in the market and earn offsetting revenue, but we don't want it to participate too much. We want to make sure that it can meet its reliability obligations long term. All right, so 3 elements to our framework. And we went with the framework because, every ISO is different policies, different resource mix, different requirements. This idea of a universal dual use participation model we realized really quickly was untenable. So what we did was we tried to decide, okay, try to identify what are the key principles that need to be addressed. What are the questions that need to be answered? And so the first element we identified is, establish market participation windows in advance. And the idea here is that asset owner is going to need some clarity, some certainty about when it can participate in the market. What we try to do is identify points of flexibility. There's no one simple, one right way of doing this. So you could have predetermined eligibility windows. Again, if we think that contingency that the asset is going to be meeting is going to occur during peak hours, then we can say, all right, during peak hours, your transmission, the rest of the time you can be market as long as you come to the beginning of that peak window fully charged and ready to go. If we don't know when that contingency might arise, as CAISO said, then it can't participate in the market. What we suggested here was, well, if we can allow the asset to participate in the market, subject to a requirement that it has a floor state of charge that is equal to what the state of charge required to meet its contingency need. As long as it doesn't drop below that level, it can participate in the market however, whenever, as long as it maintains that charge to meet its reliability obligation. The second element we looked at was creating flexible market products and resource definitions. And really what we're trying to do here is make sure that the unique operational characteristics of a dual use asset are captured in the market structure, and that we can allow for instant no fault redispatch of the asset when emergencies arise. So for example, if the asset has been cleared for market participation, has accepted bids, but then is recalled to provide transmission service, they're not going to be penalized for not following through on those market bids, that residual capacity can be procured to meet those. So the point of flexibility here, so we can do this through asset definitions, taking existing resource definitions for things like, again, use limited, reliability constrained assets that can be readily adapted to dual use storage. We can look at market product creation. So several of the ISOs have a product where you can bid simultaneously into energy and ancillary service markets. So we said, okay, let's keep that, bid into energy and ancillary service markets, but also have like a flag on the asset that tells the grid operator that this is also a transmission asset and can be recalled, can be redispatched if that contingency arises. Bidding rules, we get into this a lot in the paper. This is a complex idea, but again, every time that storage asset participates in the market, there's an opportunity cost. It's reducing it's wearing itself out basically. And so that cost of the added wear and tear needs to be reflected in whatever price that asset is bidding into the market. And then finally, they're in order to limit the asset's ability to exercise market power, there may be a need to limit how much capacity it can bid into the market. Again, this is going to be highly situational depending on the size of the asset, the contingency, the size of the market. And so really what it comes down to is, this framework needs to be highly adaptable. Every dual use project is probably going to need its own unique tailored approach. And the final point we identified in our framework was to balance cost recovery mechanisms to incent market participation. Again, we want to find that balance. We want the asset owner to have incentives to participate in the market because we want that offsetting revenue to reduce costs for the rest of us. But we don't want the asset owner to just totally burn the asset out in 4 or 5 years so that we have to come back and build another storage asset and we end up losing in the long run. So there's some points of flexibility here. We really liked that option 3 in CAISO where you had full recovery of your costs through the transmission through the transmission tariff, and then a split in your market revenues between the asset owner and customers. There are a couple other ones. CAISO, late in their proceeding, just before they suspended it, had a hybrid approach they considered, where there is basically a ratchet where a storage asset starts with full regulated cost recovery, but every time it participates in the market, that gets reduced a little bit, just to recognize how that market participation is reducing the useful life of that asset. And again, it's going to depend. If it's a battery, that might need to move fairly quickly, whereas if it's a pump storage hydro asset, it doesn't have the same cycle limitations as a battery. That may move much more slowly over time. And then finally, a cap and floor mechanism. This has been used widely in the UK, where an asset gets what's called a floor in its regulated recovery, where it's guaranteed to earn a certain amount, and that's recovered through transmission tariffs. And then it's allowed to keep whatever it earns in the market. And then if it exceeds a cap that has been predetermined, then anything above the cap is returned back to customers. That raises some questions about how do you balance market participation, ensure that you're not providing too much of an incentive for the asset owner to participate in the market and burn itself out. Again, this comes back to the technology. If it's a battery, we might want to be a little more judicious about market participation. If it's something like a pump storage hydro asset or a flow battery, for example, we may have a little more flexibility in how much is participating. So with that, we've come to the end. Happy to take any questions. It looks like there's some comments in there.
Thank you, Jeremy. We do have a number of questions queued up.
Okay.
And Courtney, thank you for collecting those. Great presentation, and you have left abundant time for question and answer. So with that, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and start off with 2 questions. I do want to preview. The second question leads right into Nora's question that came in through the Q&A from Bonneville Power. The first question is, looking at many of the early proposals and current successes in deploying energy storage as a grid asset, a byproduct invariably is better asset utilization or higher capacity factor of the existing grid. So not only are you getting life extension through de-stressing, higher energy throughput without having increased peak ratings, you're just getting better utilization of the asset. More megawatt hours transmitted per period of time. My question to you, among the various investment recovery mechanisms, market or regulated, are any of these that you've looked at recognizing and attributing a value for increasing the asset utilization or capacity factor of the wires?
No, not that I'm aware of. And, and that kind of gets into that. It feels like an age-old question. Maybe it's just the last few years, but that missing money problem in markets where there are benefits to a number of different assets, a number of different technologies that aren't compensated through market mechanisms. That one, that's an interesting one. How would you quantify a storage asset's contribution to that higher, we'll call it load factor, system usage factor? And how would you evaluate that? I don't know. That's an interesting question. But to my knowledge, no one's doing that.
Yeah, and we got a follow-up question from Vitz. The capacity factor is the fact that if you're dealing with high peaks, your total you're getting less equal energy through a bigger pipeline leads to lower utilization. So if you have that constrained pipeline and you're smoothing out your peaks by shifting energy, that's how you're increasing the capacity factor of wires. A lot of times people think of capacity factor in terms of resources, but the same concept applies. And Jeremy, your term load factor might help clear up that confusion, but if you look at the math, it's the same. The second question I have to quick kick off Q&A is NERC has done several studies evaluating solutions to reduction in system level inertia. In one of their deepest reports, they identified that energy storage and hybrid systems, PV plus energy storage, if the controls are set correctly, are among the fastest responding units. And while they don't directly provide inertia, fast frequency response as a service mitigates some of the impacts of loss of inertia. Now here, this is a meaty one because a lot of people attribute inertial support as a resource aspect, but there's, in my mind, energy storage could apply that as a transmission asset as well, or a market asset. But my question to you is, in your evaluation of this exploration of market or grid service, has fast frequency response come up as an application of service of interest?
No, there's a lot to unpack in that question. So you've got the missing money problem. So fast frequency response, not something that's compensated everywhere. Inertia, not something that's ever compensated, not technically a grid service. If you look at the FERC and NERC defined grid services, inertia is not a service. That's one reason you don't get paid for it. It's really, as you said, it's just about frequency. Inertia helps you maintain the frequency. Frequency response also helps you maintain the frequency. So the grid service is frequency regulation. So yeah, I think sometimes we get caught in this idea that, oh, we have to have inertia on the system. We don't. It's not a grid service. It's a thing that's good to have, but it is replaceable. But to your question, so I think you're starting to get at another idea we've explored elsewhere in other projects where there's this idea of embedded storage. So what we're talking about here is storage where it's a transmission asset, it's a generation asset, maybe it's both, but it's still got a very clear role. We've talked about this idea of embedded storage in other projects where, what if we just, instead of thinking about storage as something we add to the grid to increase flexibility, we pair it with a generator, we put it at our house, we put it at a substation. What if we thought about storage as just part of the system, like we do with it's like a transmission line or a transformer or a substation. It's just there on the system. We're just building a flexible and buffered system with sponges in it, if you want to call it that, so that you don't necessarily need inertia. You don't necessarily need a lot of frequency regulation because that storage is in the middle, just absorbing those differences. That's kind of like the step beyond what we're talking about today. And if anyone's interested, you can reach out to me and I can point you to the work we've done in that space.
And that's a perfect segue. The idea of buffering with energy storage will be a good lead into Nora's question. I don't know if you can see the Q&A. It's in the chat as well as in the consolidated Q&A. But to tee that up, Nora, Bonneville Power has worked with Sandia to look at active damping to mitigate inter-area oscillations. And Jeremy, NERC's first shot across the bow was to assign fast frequency response past the obligations at balancing area level, and then let the balancing areas, figure out how they're going to pro rata assign that responsibility as I'll call it a critical service that's not released to the market yet, but it's being recognized as a capability. So BPA as a federal power authority with a big footprint and, they manage the frequency reliability of their region would be a great test bed to, again, dig into this fast frequency response. And it ties into some of the seminal work they've done, looking at, in particular, a BPA report with Sandia where they looked at modulating the Pacific DC intertie, as well as modulating a fairly modest amount of energy storage, 100 megawatts, and found that modulated energy storage can mitigate inter-area oscillation. Now, that's not necessarily frequency response support, but that same capability could be repurposed or dual purposed. With that, hopefully you've had a chance to read Nora's question and give you your policy insights.
Just for anyone who doesn't see it. So Nora's question is, can you discuss how dual use storage projects would work in locations like Washington with no RTO or organized market? Would BPA likely be the first mover in terms of using storage as a transmission asset? So great question. I didn't talk about it in the presentation. We did talk about this in the paper. If you are in a vertically integrated region, it's different in some ways, it's the same in some ways. So you have an advantage in a vertically integrated region because you don't have the same strong division between transmission and generation that you have in ISO. If you're vertically integrated utility, you're doing both. And so it's a lot easier for you to do both. The challenge you have is that it might be a little more challenging to identify the benefits of that because you don't have a market telling you what the value of those generation services are. But we do have some language in the paper kind of pointing out that, you know, these principles, right, we're trying to identify are applicable to non-ISO regions, to vertically integrated regions. You know, they can still take these planning principles and figure out, okay, how do we incorporate storage into our transmission planning process? You can also look at what we've tried to do around identifying the generation values, those non-transmission values. That's going to be up to the utility to determine what those values of, you know, energy and ancillary services and whatever else that asset can do. So yeah, it's a pros and cons thing. You don't have any regulatory limitations on doing it. Might be a little more challenging to figure out the value. In terms of first movers, you know, BPA is the largest transmission owner, certainly a possibility, but, you know, really any transmission owning entity, even a small one, can potentially find these opportunities if their transmission planning process is actively looking for them.
Jeremy, we've got a couple follow-on questions about how do people get hold of the paper you mentioned in your response?
Oh, that's a great question. I will put a link to it in the chat.
And another shout out to BPA. Their 5-corridor 9 wires alternative solicitation was a big success. And, you know, even at the time, my thought was, well, you can go from city level demand response to large scale energy storage and then start stacking values. Jeremy, recommend jumping down to the peeling the onion question. It's in the Q&A, also captured in the Word document as well, if you could see that.
Yeah. So question is basically, you know, with this framework, does it make sense for grid operators to reopen investigations? Hopefully, you know, our objective here was to just objectively inform those proceedings. You know, we're not trying to advocate for anything. We're not trying to make specific recommendations around what any region should or should not do. But our hope, kind of our gold standard, is if a region and its utilities and its stakeholders get together and say, hey, we want to do this, here's this resource that helps us figure this out, and we're going to do it in a way that makes sense in our region, you know, that's our ideal situation. As I mentioned, I know MISO has brought it back up. The New York ISO, I recently presented this concept at a conference in New York, and I understand that the New York ISO is putting this idea on its study agenda for future consideration. So yeah, hopefully this can be useful in those proceedings, but that's going to be up to the individual ISOs and their stakeholders.
Jeremy, question came in. I'll reframe it this way. You know, due to stated charge limits, you know, is the market service limited to frequency regulation? From a market evolution standpoint, I know most markets have got much more sophisticated in their overly cautious approach to limited energy storage and stated charge to a more, I'll call it, dynamic approach. But maybe you can comment from a policy standpoint, and I'll tag on more of a techie response to that as well.
So the question is, like, what are the market services that it can provide?
Yeah, it's a stated charge limit. Let's generalize it. Does stated charge management of energy storage limit the services that a system can provide?
Yeah. So one of our key assumptions was that this is not going to be a capacity resource. You know, to be a capacity resource, you need to be firm, you need to be available. And a dual use asset by definition cannot commit to the market in that way. It's likely going to be needed for contingencies during peak periods. And even if it's not absolutely needed, it's potentially needed. So it can't commit as a capacity resource. So we did not assume, and in the Argonne paper that followed on, there were no assumed capacity payments. It was mostly energy provision during off-peak periods and an ancillary service provision as well. But yeah, if you are doing that model that we talked about, where you're just managing state of charge and always in the market, I have to think it would be mostly ancillary services.
To expand on a little bit of that from a techie standpoint is, you know, most frequency regulation systems proved out that they don't need to remove themselves to rebalance, that they can actively manage state of charge. And here's a quick example. A lot of implementations are, you know, you're always switching around to zero. So when you're asked to take charge, reduce frequency, you respond at the front end of the SCADA signal, and you got 4 seconds, right, to respond. When you're asked to discharge, you wait to the very last second. at the end of that 4-second. And systems that use that management system have no problem even adjusting their state of charge over the course of 24 hours to do things like to be ready to accept more charge during solar ramp up, and then to have excess discharge during solar ramp down in the evening. So there are systems, 8-Minute Energy in California is one, selling to LADWP, where they've been very successful doing 24/7 ancillary service and still doing diurnal capacity. And Jeremy, maybe if you can comment, you mentioned how California ISO works with the California PUC to define capacity need in load pockets. And there they are, here's a challenge, maybe it generalizes. There's no pro forma tariff, but there are cutting bilateral contracts for 4-hour energy storage, and those load pockets are getting a capacity payment. Is that correct? And is that a model to turn it into a pro forma, more of a tariffed approach versus boutique?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, it's going to depend on the capacity market structure. You know, California's is somewhat unique. I don't know that that model is readily applicable in other regions. I also understand that in a few load pockets, they've started derating 4-hour storage just because the need is growing longer. But that's anecdotal. I'm not positive about that, but that is my understanding.
Yeah, and I think we have colleagues really working, and part of the grid storage launchpad help work with the industry. And you know, here's where it's not going to come out of R&D. It's going to be a multi-stakeholder question. What is long duration energy storage? Why would you use it? Because in my experience, there's a point in diminishing returns when you're looking at traditional grid services and not super aggressive resilience type services. Courtney, going back to the Q&A, seeing if anything else is, Jeremy, how does storage owner get paid for transmission grid service to improve reliability? They say resilience/reliability. I know there are established mechanisms for reliability-based planning. Maybe you can comment on that first and then take the more greenfield question of resilience. Who's getting paid for that?
So who's getting paid for resilience? Nobody. We don't pay people for that. It's a problem. Yep. You know, we've done other work where we've kind of put forth this idea that if you want to do resilience, you have to do reliability, because you will get paid for reliability and you won't get paid for resilience. And even if you do get paid for resilience, if you think about it, resilience, you're going to need 0.001% of the time. That's just not enough time to recover your costs. So that other 99.99% of the time, your asset, your investment needs to be designed in a way that's providing reliability services and earning that revenue to pay for itself. But the bigger question of how do you get paid for transmission, you know, interstate transmission is FERC jurisdictional. So if as long as you're not in Texas, because Texas is independent and does their own thing, anywhere else in the country, you're FERC jurisdictional for transmission. FERC will authorize your transmission rates. If you are a public utility, your state utility commission will also authorize your transmission recovery. And then what you actually get paid is a blend of what your FERC revenues from allowing other people to use your transmission system, and then your costs from your captive customers from their use of your transmission system. But these are all regulated rates, whether it's FERC or state utility commission. They're regulated rates, they're set rates. Once you are a transmission asset, you have regulated recovery and a chance to earn a return on that recovery, but it's all regulated.
And by regulated, that's one big difference. So this means the owner of the energy storage in this scenario is a regulated entity that's recovering their costs through regulated rates with a set limit on the profit. Is that correct?
Yeah. If the storage were authorized as a transmission asset, then yes, it would be recovering its costs through FERC jurisdictional rates or state utility commission jurisdictional rates, or some mix of the two.
A follow on to that was, what's the difference between resilience and reliability?
The $1 million question. I'll give my answer. I will caveat that by saying you will get people who strongly disagree with me. You will get people who give you different answers. My answer is they're on the same continuum, because reliability, resilience, we're talking about customer outages, right? That's what we're talking about. At the end of the day, it's the outages that customers experience. So to me, reliability and resilience exist on the same continuum. The dividing point to me is IEEE standard 1366 that defines a major event day. Well, it defines like your SAIDI and your safety scores. It defines major event day. And so IEEE 1366 says anytime that there's a major event that causes your SAIDI and safety scores, your reliability metrics to go above 2.5 times or 2.5 standard deviations above their average, that's a major event. Historically, we don't count those in reliability scores. We don't hold utilities responsible for them. They've been viewed as beyond the utility's responsibility. Obviously, the situation is changing. We're seeing increased intensity of those major events. We're seeing increased frequency of those major events. So you're seeing a push now to say, well, maybe we should try to plan and do something for resilience. But to me, that's the difference. You know, IEEE 1366 says, here's reliability, and then here's this major event day, and anything beyond that is resilience. That's how I organize it in my head.
I think that's a good way to organize it, but it also points there's an opportunity because the industry is changing around this topic. Now we're running up at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, attendees, for your attention and your questions. I'd like to also thank Carly and Courtney, who have set all of this up for us, both the presenters and the attendees. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to our organizers, Courtney and Carly, to wrap us up. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you. And if you have questions, exactly, Carly's got it in the chat window there. Please reach out to Jeremy. We didn't get through all the questions that were asked, and I apologize, but I think we had some really good discussion and conversation around things. And I know that we will post this video out on our YouTube channel. That link has previously been shared. And if you have that link, go ahead and click it, give us a couple days. And you could also look at the past presentations that are out there if you're interested in those as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Carly.